I didn't react when they fired me, not because it didn't hurt, but because something inside me had already gone quiet long before that room, like I had been slowly erased piece by piece and only just noticed the outline of what I used to be. 12 years at Redwood Supply Group, reduced to a rehearsed sentence delivered by Daniel Hughes while HR avoided eye contact, and I sat there nodding like I understood, like I agreed, like I hadn't just watched my entire identity get reassigned to someone else weeks before I even knew I was disposable. It wasn't the job. It was the realization that every late night, every system I built, every crisis I solved had been quietly transferred, repackaged, and handed over as if I had never existed. And the worst part wasn't the betrayal. It was how clean it was, how planned, how precise. They didn't just remove me, they replaced me before I could even feel the loss. I remember walking out of that building, not angry, not even broken, just empty, like something essential had been taken without permission. That was the moment I understood something dangerous. This wasn't something I needed to fight. This was something I needed to finish.
What would you do if the company you gave your best years to erased you like you never mattered? I remember the room more clearly than I remember their words. The glass walls, the reflection behind Daniel Hughes, my own face, still, too still. He was talking. I could see his lips moving. Restructuring. Difficult decision. Nothing personal. Nothing personal. I nodded. Not because I agreed, but because my body didn't know how to react yet. 12 years. I kept thinking that number in my head like it meant something, like if I repeated it enough, it would force them to pause, to reconsider, to acknowledge it. But it didn't. Because this wasn't a decision made in that room. This had already happened. I felt it in the way he avoided specifics, in the way HR slid the paper toward me before I even asked a question, in the way no one mentioned my projects. My projects. The systems I built, the contracts I secured, the nights I stayed when everyone else left. Gone from the conversation, like I was. I remember placing my hand on the table just to feel something solid, something real, because inside something had already started collapsing. Not loudly, not dramatically, quietly, like a building being emptied before demolition. I should have been angry. I should have said something, but all I felt was this strange, controlled silence, like my brain was protecting me from something worse. Daniel kept talking. Something about transition support, something about future opportunities. And I realized he had practiced this, not just the words, the tone, the pauses, the way he leaned back slightly after delivering the final line. Your role is no longer required. No longer required. Like I was a tool. Like I had an expiration date I was never told about. I stood up, calm, too calm. I even thanked them. That part still bothers me, because I don't remember deciding to say it. It just came out, automatic, like the version of me that still believed in loyalty hadn't caught up yet. I walked out of the room slowly, not because I wanted to, but because I didn't trust my legs to move any faster. The hallway looked the same, the people looked the same, but something had shifted, something permanent. I passed by the operations floor, and for a second I almost walked in, almost sat back down at my desk, almost continued like nothing happened, because for 12 years, that's what I did. I fixed things. I stayed. I made it work. But this time, there was nothing left to fix. Not for them. And that's when it hit me. Not the loss, not the anger. Something else. Something colder. Because as I stood there, watching people work on systems I built, I realized something didn't make sense. They weren't surprised. No one was. And that meant one thing. This didn't start today, and whatever they had planned was already in motion.
I didn't go home right away. I sat in my car, engine off, hands still on the wheel like I was waiting for instructions that weren't coming. I kept replaying the meeting, not what they said, but what they didn't say. The gaps, the silences, the things I ignored because I trusted them. Daniel Hughes praising my work just weeks ago, the sudden access restrictions to certain reports, the meetings I was no longer required to attend. I told myself it was restructuring, adjustment, growth. I didn't question it because I thought I was part of it. That was my mistake. I reached into my bag and pulled out my laptop, opened it. Muscle memory. I tried to log in to the system. Access denied. I frowned. Tried again. Nothing. And then I saw it. An email I hadn't opened before the meeting, sent 2 days ago. Subject line, Transition Plan Phase 2. Phase 2. My chest tightened, but not in panic, in clarity. I opened it, and there it was. My name, listed under Legacy Support, completed. Completed. Below it, another name, Ethan Cole, assigned to all my systems, all my accounts, all my responsibilities, effective immediately. 2 days ago. 2 days before I was even told. I leaned back in my seat, stared at the screen, and for the first time, I felt it. Not anger. Not yet. Something deeper. Something heavier. They didn't just decide to fire me. They replaced me before I even knew I was gone. What would you do if the humiliation didn't end when you walked away? Because mine didn't. It followed me. In that email. In that word. Completed. Like I was a task, a phase, a step in a process that no longer needed me. I closed the laptop slowly, not because I was overwhelmed, but because something inside me had just shifted, permanently. This wasn't about losing a job. This was about losing something I couldn't get back. My position, my reputation, my future in that company, my identity. Gone, reassigned, rewritten. And the worst part? They expected me to disappear quietly, to accept it, to move on, like nothing happened. I looked back at the building through the windshield. Same lights, same windows, same people inside. But now I could see it clearly. This wasn't restructuring. This wasn't bad timing. This wasn't unfortunate. This was planned, carefully, precisely. And if they planned this, then they also believed something else, that I wouldn't see it, that I wouldn't understand it, that I wouldn't do anything about it. I exhaled slowly, not to calm down, but to steady something new forming inside me. Because in that moment, I stopped thinking like someone who had been fired and started thinking like someone who had been removed for a reason. And that reason was still hidden, but not for long. I didn't call anyone. Not a friend, not a colleague, not even family. Silence was the first decision I made that actually felt like control. The next morning, I didn't wake up early like I used to. No urgency, no emails, no pressure. But my mind was sharper than it had been in years. Because for the first time, I wasn't inside Redwood Supply Group. I was outside it. And that changed everything. I opened my laptop again, not to work, to watch. Internal dashboards I had access to before, gone. Company systems, locked. But they forgot something. External communication channels. The shared threads with Harrington and Co., the email chains, the timelines. They didn't cut me off there. Not completely. And that told me something important. They were confident. Too confident. I scrolled through recent messages. Ethan Cole already replying in threads that used to be mine. Short responses, vague confirmations, no depth. He didn't understand the system, not really. He was maintaining it, not controlling it. There's a difference, a dangerous one. I leaned back and read carefully, line by line. James Harrington asking specific questions about delivery timelines, integration checkpoints, contingency plans. Questions I used to answer instantly. Now, delayed responses, generic replies. I could almost feel the hesitation through the screen. And then I saw it. A message Ethan sent late at night, probably thinking no one would notice. Final deployment schedule confirmed. No delays expected. I stared at that line longer than I should have, because I knew something he didn't. That schedule was impossible. Without the back-end adjustments I built, adjustments only I fully understood, there was no way they could deliver on time. No way. And yet, they promised it anyway. I closed my eyes for a second. Not out of stress, out of clarity. This wasn't just arrogance. This was a weakness. They had removed the one person who knew how to hold everything together and replaced him with someone who didn't even know where the cracks were. And the worst part? They didn't see it. Not yet. I didn't rush, didn't react, didn't interfere. I just watched. Because there's a moment right before something breaks, when everything looks stable. Perfect, even. That's where they were. Still celebrating, still confident, still believing they had control. And I let them believe it, because the more comfortable they became, the harder the fall would be. And as I stared at that message again, I realized something that changed everything. They weren't just exposed, they were committed. Locked into a promise they couldn't keep, and they had no idea how close they already were to failing.
I didn't destroy anything. Not yet. That would have been easy. Too easy. Instead, I chose something smaller, something precise, something they wouldn't immediately trace back to me. I opened the email thread again. Harrington and Co. James Harrington, a name I had worked with for months, a man who trusted me, not Redwood. That distinction mattered. I didn't email him directly, not at first. That would raise suspicion. Instead, I replied to an older thread, one that was still active but quiet, a technical clarification discussion, something subtle. I kept it simple, professional, measured. I wanted to flag a minor concern regarding the current deployment schedule. Based on the original infrastructure design, certain back-end dependencies may require additional validation to avoid delays. It might be worth revisiting those checkpoints before final confirmation. No accusations, no blame, just doubt, carefully placed. I read it twice, then sent it. And then I waited. Hours passed. Nothing. Then a response. Not from Ethan, from James. Can you clarify which dependencies you're referring to? I didn't rush to answer. Timing matters. Control matters. I waited just long enough to make it feel natural, then replied. Specific points, technical language, enough detail to sound credible, but not enough to solve the problem. That wasn't my job anymore. Minutes later, another message. This time, the tone had changed. Shorter, sharper. Has this been accounted for in the current timeline? And there it was. The shift. Small, but real. Doubt inside the deal. I leaned back and exhaled slowly. Not satisfaction, not yet, just confirmation. They were vulnerable, more than they realized. Because doubt spreads, quietly, slowly, and once it starts, it doesn't stop on its own. I closed the laptop, not because I was done, but because I knew something they didn't. This wasn't damage. This was pressure. The kind that builds over time. The kind that doesn't explode until it's too late to fix. Somewhere inside Redwood, someone was about to feel that shift. The hesitation, the questions, the cracks forming under something they thought was solid. And when they did, they wouldn't know where it started. They wouldn't know why. They wouldn't know it was me. And that was the point. Because this wasn't about reacting. This was about control. And control takes time. They thought it was over. I knew it had just started.
The first crack didn't sound like anything. No explosion, no confrontation, no panic. Just a delay. I saw it in the thread. A follow-up question from James Harrington that didn't get answered for 6 hours. 6 hours for something that used to take me 6 minutes. That's how it starts. Not with failure, with hesitation. I didn't touch anything after that. I didn't need to. Because once doubt enters a system, it begins to feed on itself. By the second day, the tone had shifted. More questions, more clarifications, more just to confirm messages. Ethan Cole started replying faster. Too fast. His responses were longer now, trying to sound confident. But I could see it. The over-explaining, the slight inconsistencies, the gaps he didn't realize he was leaving behind. Daniel Hughes joined the thread. That was new. He never used to get involved in technical conversations. That told me everything I needed to know. They were feeling it. Not the problem itself, but the pressure of it. And pressure changes people. It makes them rush. It makes them defensive. It makes them visible. I watched quietly, day after day, like I wasn't even part of the equation anymore, like I didn't exist. And that's what made it work, because no one looks for a threat they believe is gone. Internally, I started mapping everything, their responses, their timing, their tone. Patterns began to form. Ethan answering late at night, Daniel stepping in during critical questions, short internal replies followed by long external explanations. They were compensating, trying to hold something together they didn't fully understand. And the more they tried, the more unstable it became. I should have felt something, satisfaction, vindication, but I didn't. Because this wasn't emotional anymore. It was structural, like watching a system fail exactly the way you predicted it would. There's no excitement in that, only certainty. But something else started happening, something I didn't expect. I began to feel different. Not better, not stronger, just colder, more precise, more detached. Like I wasn't reacting to what they did to me, I was studying it, using it, becoming something shaped by it. And that realization stayed with me longer than anything else. Because revenge isn't just about what you do to them. It's about what it turns you into. And I could feel that change happening, slowly, quietly, permanently. Then came the update that changed the timeline. A message from James. Short, direct. We're finalizing internal approvals by end of week. Need full confirmation before signing. End of week. That was the deadline. Not just for them, for everything. Because once that deal was signed, nothing I did would matter anymore. And for the first time since I walked out of that building, I felt something close to urgency. Not panic, not fear, just time running out.
Deadlines don't create pressure. They reveal it. And now, everything was moving faster. Emails came in shorter bursts, more frequent, less controlled. Ethan stopped explaining as much. Now he was confirming things, quickly, almost aggressively, like saying it with confidence would make it true. Daniel Hughes was different. His messages were calculated, careful, but I could see the shift. He started copying more people into threads, legal, finance, operations. That's not confidence, that's containment. They were trying to spread responsibility because somewhere inside they knew something wasn't right, but they didn't know what. And that uncertainty is where pressure turns into fear. I watched it build, slowly, precisely, and for the first time I asked myself something I hadn't before. How long could you pretend to be harmless if everything depended on it? Because that's what this had become, a performance. I wasn't reacting, I wasn't visible, I wasn't even part of the conversation anymore. And yet, everything was moving because of something I started. That realization should have felt powerful, but it didn't. It felt dangerous. Because control like this doesn't leave room for mistakes. And for a moment, just a moment, I considered stopping, walking away, letting them deal with the consequences on their own. Because what I was doing wasn't just exposing a flaw, it was guiding it, shaping it. And once something like that starts, it doesn't stop cleanly. It collapses completely. I stood up and walked away from the screen. Needed distance, needed silence. But even then, my mind didn't stop. It replayed everything, every system I built, every shortcut I designed, every hidden dependency I never documented because I didn't think I needed to. Because I was there. I was always there. Until I wasn't. And then it hit me. Not slowly, not subtly. All at once. There was something they didn't know, something they couldn't see, something buried so deep in the system that even Ethan wouldn't stumble into it by accident. A fail-safe. Not designed to break anything, but designed to protect the system under stress. A mechanism that would trigger if timelines were forced beyond a certain threshold. Delay protocols, rerouting logic, internal verification loops, all dependent on one thing. Me. Access I no longer had, control they didn't understand. If the system hit that threshold without the correct overrides, it wouldn't fail immediately. It would stall, silently. Progress would slow, then stop, and by the time they realized it, it would already be too late to recover. I stood there, completely still, because this wasn't pressure anymore. This wasn't doubt. This was collapse, and they were heading straight toward it without even knowing it existed.
The shift wasn't subtle anymore. It didn't stay inside emails. It didn't hide behind delayed replies. It started showing, externally, publicly. I saw it in the update James Harrington sent. Short, controlled, but different. We're revisiting certain operational assumptions before final confirmation. Revisiting. That word alone was enough. Because in deals like this, nothing gets revisited unless something is wrong. And when something is wrong, everyone starts looking. Inside Redwood Supply Group, that meant pressure, real pressure. Not the kind you manage with confident emails, the kind that forces meetings, emergency calls, late nights that don't feel productive, just desperate. I could almost picture it. Daniel Hughes standing at the head of a room, trying to hold control. Ethan Cole explaining things he didn't fully understand. Teams cross-checking systems that used to run smoothly without question. And for the first time, I wasn't inside fixing it. I was outside, watching it spread. That was the difference. That was the shift. Because once doubt becomes visible, it stops being manageable. It becomes political. People start protecting themselves. Blame starts moving quietly between departments. Confidence starts breaking, not all at once, but in pieces. I didn't need access to see it. I could feel it in the timing. Emails that used to come in clean threads, now fragmented. Different people asking the same questions, answers being repeated, slightly changed each time. That's not clarity, that's confusion. And confusion is where systems begin to fail. But I stayed still. No new messages, no interference. Because the worst thing I could do now was rush. This wasn't about speed. This was about inevitability. Let them move. Let them try to fix it. Let them believe they still had control. Because the deeper they went, the harder it would be to pull back. And then it happened. The moment I knew it had crossed the line. An internal email forwarded by mistake, or maybe by someone too overwhelmed to notice. Daniel Hughes, subject, immediate risk assessment. 3 words, but the content, that's what mattered. Identify all points of failure in current deployment. Prioritize client-facing risks. We cannot afford exposure at this stage. Cannot afford exposure. That wasn't confidence. That was fear, carefully worded. I stared at the screen longer than I should have. Not because I was surprised, but because it confirmed something I had been waiting for. They knew. Not everything, not yet, but enough to understand this wasn't under control anymore. And once leadership feels that, they start looking for causes, not problems, people. I closed the email slowly because I knew what came next. Suspicion, not technical, personal. And when that happens, names start coming up, even names that aren't supposed to matter anymore. And somewhere inside that building, Daniel Hughes was about to realize something uncomfortable. The one person who understood all of this was no longer there, and that absence was starting to feel like a presence. And it wouldn't take long before that presence started pointing back at me.
He didn't call me immediately. That would have been too obvious. Daniel Hughes was smarter than that. He waited. A day, maybe 2, long enough to confirm something, long enough to make sure this wasn't just a technical issue, but a pattern. And then my phone rang. I stared at the screen. His name. I let it ring once, twice, 3 times. Then I answered. Calm, controlled. Mark. Just my name. No greeting. No pretense. I could hear it in his voice. Not anger. Not yet. Something tighter. Measured. We need to talk. Need. Not want. Not prefer. Need. I leaned back slightly, kept my tone neutral. About what? A pause. Small, but real. And in that pause, I heard it. The uncertainty. The lack of control he wasn't used to feeling. There are complications with the Harrington deal. Complications. I almost smiled, but I didn't, because this wasn't the moment for that. This was the moment for distance. I'm not with Redwood anymore, I said quietly. I wouldn't know. Another pause, longer this time, because he knew I was lying. Not about knowing, about being involved.
"You were involved in the original systems," he said carefully. "You understand how this works." There it was. Not an accusation. An opening. An attempt to pull me back in. Not as an employee, as a solution. But that door was already closed. "You replaced me," I replied. "I assume Ethan has everything he needs." Silence. He didn't respond immediately, because that was the part he couldn't argue with, and we both knew it. The conversation shifted after that, subtly, less about fixing the problem, more about understanding it. He asked questions, carefully phrased, trying to map something he couldn't see. But every answer I gave was just enough to confirm the complexity, not enough to solve it. Because this wasn't a conversation, this was a trap. Not the one he thought he was setting, the one he had already walked into. Because everything happening now was already in motion long before that meeting room, long before I was fired. The systems, the dependencies, the fail-safes, they weren't built for revenge, they were built for stability. But stability depends on the right hands, and when those hands are removed, the system doesn't break immediately. It waits, it adapts, and then it fails, exactly the way it was designed to. "I might need you to come in," Daniel said finally. "Consult, just temporarily." There it was, the full circle, from no longer required to necessary. But he was too late. Not because I refused, but because it didn't matter anymore. "You should focus on your current team," I said calmly. "They're the ones responsible now." I ended the call before he could respond. Not out of disrespect, out of finality. Because there was nothing left to discuss, nothing left to negotiate, nothing left to fix. I placed the phone down slowly, and for the first time since this started, I allowed myself to acknowledge the truth. This wasn't building anymore. This wasn't pressure. This wasn't a warning. This was impact. And the most dangerous part, it had already begun. There was no stopping it now, because the damage they were trying to prevent had already happened.
Everything started closing in at once. Not just on them, on me, because control has a cost, and I was starting to feel it. The updates were no longer subtle. They were urgent now. James Harrington's tone had changed again. Shorter emails, direct questions, no room for delay. Final confirmation required within 48 hours. 48 hours. That was it. Not a window, a countdown. Inside Redwood Supply Group, I could imagine what that meant. No more internal debates, no more careful language, just pressure. Raw, immediate, relentless. And for the first time, I wasn't just watching it, I was part of it. Because everything that was happening because of something I started. I told myself it was justified. I told myself they deserved it. But justification doesn't quiet your mind at night. It doesn't stop the questions. What happens when this collapses completely? Who gets pulled down with it? How far does it spread? Because this wasn't just Daniel Hughes anymore, or Ethan Cole. There were teams involved now. People who didn't make the decision to replace me. People who were just there, trying to keep things running, the same way I used to. That thought stayed with me longer than I expected, long enough to make me hesitate, long enough to make me question something I hadn't before. Was I still in control, or was I just pushing something that couldn't be stopped anymore? I stood in my apartment staring at the city outside, lights everywhere, lives moving forward, unaware, unconnected. And yet, somewhere in that same city, a system I built was slowly collapsing under pressure I helped create. I ran my hand across my face.
tired. Not physically, something deeper. Because revenge doesn't feel the way people think it does. It's not satisfaction. It's not relief. It's weight. Constant. Heavy. And the closer you get to the end, the heavier it becomes. I picked up my phone, scrolled through my contacts, paused on one name, James Harrington. I could stop it. Right there. One call, one explanation, one intervention. I could stabilize everything, walk away clean, let Redwood deal with the aftermath without total destruction. That option was real, within reach, and for a moment I considered it. Seriously. Because what I was about to do wasn't reversible. Once the system hit that threshold, once the fail-safes activated without me there to guide them, there would be no quick fix, no recovery window, just failure. Public, visible, permanent. My hand tightened slightly around the phone, not out of anger, out of awareness, because this wasn't about them anymore. This was about me, about who I was becoming, and whether I could still recognize that person after this was over. The clock was ticking, 48 hours, and I was standing at the edge of something that didn't have a reset. All it needed was for me to do nothing.
I didn't make the call, not to stop it, because something inside me had already decided. But the decision wasn't what I expected. It wasn't about pushing harder. It wasn't about accelerating the collapse. It was about precision. Because if this was going to happen, it had to happen clean, controlled, final. I sat back down and opened my laptop again. Not to watch, to act, but carefully, deliberately. I went back to the one place they still trusted, the communication channel with Harrington and Co., the thread where everything still looked professional, stable, manageable. I typed slowly, not like before. This wasn't about planting doubt anymore. This was about clarity. I want to ensure full transparency before final confirmation. Based on the current deployment structure, there are critical dependencies that require direct system-level oversight to maintain timeline integrity. Without that oversight, delays are not just possible, they are likely. I stopped there, read it again. No blame, no exposure, just truth, positioned exactly where it needed to be. Then I sent it and waited. Minutes passed. Then the response came. Not from Ethan, not from Daniel, from James. Immediate, direct. Are you saying the current team cannot deliver this as promised? I stared at the screen, because this was it, the moment everything turned. One answer would define everything that followed. And for a second, just a second, I saw both outcomes. One where I softened it, protected them, let the deal move forward, and one where I didn't, where I let reality speak for itself. If winning meant becoming someone you no longer recognize, would you still finish? The question didn't feel theoretical anymore. It felt personal, immediate, and the answer was already there. I typed slowly, every word measured. They don't fully understand the system they're relying on. I didn't add anything else, didn't need to, because that sentence carried everything. The silence after that was different, heavy, not confused, not uncertain, resolved. And then it happened. Not publicly, not loudly, but clearly. A new message appeared in the thread from James Harrington. We are pausing final approval until further technical validation is completed. Paused. That was the word. But what it really meant was doubt had won.
Control had shifted, and somewhere inside Redwood Supply Group, everything was about to unravel. I leaned back slowly, not relieved, not satisfied, just still. Because the most important part of this moment wasn't the pause, it was what came with it, awareness. They knew now, not everything, but enough. Enough to start asking the right questions, enough to start looking in the right direction. And it wouldn't take long, because there was only one person who understood all of this, only one person who had been removed right before it started falling apart. And for the first time, Daniel Hughes wasn't guessing anymore. He knew who was behind it.
The collapse didn't happen all at once. It never does. It started quietly, the same way everything else had. The delay turned into a pause. The pause turned into questions, and the questions turned into doubt that couldn't be contained anymore. James Harrington didn't rush. That was the difference. He didn't accuse. He didn't react emotionally. He investigated. And that was far more dangerous, because once someone like him starts looking closely, they don't stop at surface-level answers. They dig deep. I saw it in the shift of communication. No more broad threads, no more group emails. Now it was direct, targeted, technical audits, independent reviews, requests for system validation from third-party consultants. That was the moment Redwood Supply Group lost control. Not when the deal paused, but when they were no longer the only ones explaining it. Ethan Cole's responses became shorter, then defensive, then inconsistent, because the more questions he got, the clearer it became. He didn't build this. He didn't understand it. And Daniel Hughes, he tried to hold it together. He pushed harder, scheduled emergency calls, pulled in more teams, added layers of explanation. But more explanation only exposed more gaps. That's the thing about systems built under pressure. They don't break loudly. They reveal themselves, piece by piece, until there's nothing left to defend. I didn't intervene anymore, didn't send another message, didn't guide anything, because I didn't need to. Everything that needed to happen was already in motion. The fail-safes I built started triggering exactly as designed. Not destruction, but restriction. Delays that couldn't be bypassed, verification loops that couldn't be skipped, processes that required a level of understanding no one there had. Progress slowed, then stalled, and once it stalled publicly, there was no hiding it. James didn't ask questions anymore. He made decisions, clear, final, controlled. We are withdrawing from the agreement pending full operational reliability. Withdrawing, not pausing, not delaying, ending. And just like that, the deal Redwood had been betting everything on was gone. Not because of one mistake, but because of a structure they never fully understood. Inside the company, I didn't need updates to know what was happening. I could see it, in the silence, in the absence of new communication, in the sudden disappearance of confidence. Because when something that big collapses, it doesn't stay contained. It spreads into leadership, into reputation, into trust. And Daniel Hughes, he didn't call again. Not because he didn't want to, but because there was nothing left to say. He had already lost control, not just of the deal, but of the narrative. And that's what mattered most. Because once the story changes, everything else follows. Careers, positions, reputations. They don't collapse instantly. They erode,
slowly, irreversibly. I stood by the window again, looking out at the same city, same lights, same movement. But something had changed. Not outside, inside. Because this wasn't victory. There was no rush, no satisfaction, just completion, the kind that doesn't need to announce itself, because the outcome speaks on its own.
People think revenge is loud, explosive, something you can point to and say, that's when it happened. But it's not. The most effective kind barely makes a sound. By the time Redwood Supply Group understood what they lost, it was already gone. Not just the Harrington & Co. deal, something deeper, credibility, trust, the quiet confidence that holds a company together when things get uncertain. That disappeared first, then everything else followed. I heard pieces of it later, not directly, never officially, but through the same channels that once carried my work. Daniel Hughes stepping down temporarily, internal restructuring again, departments being reviewed, not because they wanted to change, because they had to. And Ethan Cole, he didn't last, not because he failed, but because he was never meant to succeed in something he didn't build. That's the part people don't understand. You can replace a person, but you can't replace understanding. You can transfer responsibilities, but you can't transfer ownership. And without that, everything becomes fragile. I didn't go back, didn't take any calls, didn't offer to fix anything, because there was nothing left there for me. That version of my life ended the moment I walked out of that room, and I accepted that fully. What I lost was real. 12 years of identity, of structure, of believing I belonged somewhere. That doesn't come back, not in the same form. But what I reclaimed mattered more. Control, clarity, truth. Not the kind they give you, the kind you take back quietly, without asking, without announcing it. And maybe that's the lesson in all of this. Not about revenge, not really, but about being underestimated. Because the most dangerous person in any room is the one everyone thinks they've already removed, the one they stop accounting for, the one they believe won't come back. I didn't need to prove anything, didn't need recognition, didn't need an apology, because in the end, the system spoke for me, the results spoke for me, and the silence that followed said everything they refused to. I still think about that room sometimes, the glass walls, the rehearsed words, the moment everything ended. But it doesn't feel the same anymore, because now I understand something I didn't then. They thought they were ending my story. They didn't realize they were stepping into it. And the loudest revenge I ever took was saying nothing.